Last week we looked at the archaeological evidence. We looked at all of the tombs, the disproportionate amount of tombs that we had for infant burials in both Avarez and Tel El Makusta, right around 1630 BCE. This would have been approximated the time of Moses's birth, but this is not the only parallel that we have. Tonight we're going to be looking at the written evidence that we have for the Exodus. And when you see all of the different points of convergence with the Exodus story, you really almost have to jump through hoops to counteract it or to refute the claim. The first thing I want to show you, and I believe I saw someone doing a screen share. I'm not sure how to do that yet, but I want to show you guys this. This is the Brooklyn Papyrus, if you can see this. And all of these names that are highlighted, and I'm going to read to you what these are, but this is the actual Brooklyn Papyrus that has been, as you can tell, it's very damaged, but we're able to read some of the names in this papyrus. Now, this papyrus dates right around 1590, 1580 BCE, somewhere in that. And the interesting thing with the Brooklyn Papyrus is that 70% of the names that appear in this document are Semitic names. We know that this came from an estate in southern Egypt. So this would have been near Thebes. This is not normally where we think of the Israelites being, but it appears, you know, if we think that Israel just stayed in the land of Goshen, I don't believe they did. It appears that they were scattered throughout the land of Egypt. Thank you, Cindy. Let's talk about that this week. I would greatly appreciate that. So what we find is that Israel was probably scattered, you know, in the land of Israel, we say from Dan to Beersheba. In Egypt, it might have been from Tajaru to Thebes, something like that, where you had a very wide range of Israelites all scattered all over the land, the same way we're all over the United States and all over the world today. So what is fascinating about this papyrus, that is a list of slaves. It is a slaves on one estate. This was either a very wealthy person or perhaps someone who was associated with the Pharaoh in some way. They were a very high position. But what's fascinating, listen to some names that appear on this papyrus. We have the name Menahem, Issachar, Asher, and then we have the name of one of the midwives that is mentioned in Exodus, the name of Shiphrah. So how is it that we have all of these names that correspond one-on-one with Israelites who would have lived at this time? And one of the things that I mentioned in the previous class was that there are two theories regarding Israel's duration in the land of Egypt and as far as the Exodus. The Samaritan Pentateuch as well as the Septuagint state that Israel was only in Egypt for 215 years and that they had been in the land of Canaan 215 years prior to that. The issue with the text is Exodus 12:40, where it states that Israel dwelt, that the time that Israel dwelt in the land of Canaan and in the land of Egypt was 430 years, so that it's divided evenly. When you reconstruct, Josephus says that it was 215 years in Canaan and 215 years in Genesis. I'm sorry, 215 years in Egypt. When you reconstruct the chronology, you find that Josephus is right. Israel would have lived in Canaan for 215 years. So the issue with the Masoretic text is that it appears it dropped the phrase "and in the land of Canaan," so that that 430 years included, the moment Abraham entered into the promised land until Israel was delivered out of Egypt back to the promised land. So when we do that, this reference to these Israelite names, it is possible that these are actually references to some of the sons of Jacob, because they could have been alive right around 1600 BCE, prior to this, depending on how long their lives lived. If they lived 150 years or 130 years, as did some of their ancestors, this very much could have been a reference to them. It is very possible too that it's a reference to Shiphrah. How likely is it to have a correspondence of 4 different names just out of the blue? The probabilities are just not that great that we would have that crossover. So that is the first piece of epigraphic evidence. The second piece that we're going to look at is the Amose stele. Now, you guys may have heard about this. I have talked about it before. It is also mentioned in different documentaries. Simca is very famous for talking about this. It's part of his Exodus Decoded. It is also referred to in the Patterns of the Exodus. So the importance of the Amose stele is that Amose, there's several things, and I will point out that there are some very important details that no one else has pointed out yet, simply because you really have to be more familiar with Egyptian history and pharaonic ascension to the throne. So when a king came to the throne of Egypt, before he could take his rightful place and be viewed by the people and by the priesthood as the king who had the ability to sit on the throne, he had to go through a very particular coronation ceremony. And the ceremony was called the opening of the mouth of Ra. And what you would do, the king actually had to gild a golden image of Ra. And by him making this golden image, he became one with Ra. And he then gained the power as Ra's son to sit on the throne of Egypt and to rule on his father's behalf over the Egyptian empire. This was a long-standing tradition that went all the way back to the Old Kingdom. So this was something that whether we look at the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, this was a rite of passage that every monarch went through. What's fascinating with the Amose stele is that Amose, who was the founder, he is considered the first monarch of the 18th dynasty. It would have been the first dynasty after the Hyksos and after the second intermediate period. And it's called the second intermediate period because Egyptian history is really fuzzy and we're really not sure where to assign the different monarchies. We can't even say for sure how long the different monarchs reigned, whether they reigned from competing cities, whether they were just judges or something like that that were elected for 2 to 4 year periods. We really don't know. We have, Josephus, and we do have the Turin Papyrus that states that kings reign for a period of 2 to 3 years. But that's kind of weird to have that sort of transition every 2 to 3 years, and it points to some sort of elected office. But what's fascinating with Amose, this stele, when it was excavated in the 1950s, was damaged. It was in Thebes, which is southern Egypt, in the Temple of Karnak. And scholars started piecing it together over like a 4-year period as they excavated different portions of this stele. Now, what's fascinating is that Amose tells us a wonderful story. He says that he was outside the capital city when, and his brother would have been alive at this time. His older brother was Kamose. He may have been up to 10 years older. We know that Kamose was actively campaigning against the Hyksos in the north. So he was going into the Delta region. He had captured On, biblical Heliopolis, or biblical On, Greek Heliopolis. He was traveling up the Nile, and he had cut off all of the Hyksos access to the Nile south of Avarez. And it appears that Kamose was on the verge of attacking Avarez. He had very recently conquered and brought into his control Tajaru, which was the city. It was a port city on the Way of Horus, better known as the Way of the Philistines. That was the road, the highway that you took into Canaan. It would have passed Sharuan, which was a Hyksos city there in the Negev. So you have all these factors, this incredible, very unstable and very Civil War-like situation where Kamose is making incredible progress, recovering the land of Egypt for the traditional pharaohs, reclaiming Egypt for Egyptians, and casting out the foreigners. Well, what's fascinating is Mose tells us that he is in another city. He has to rush back to Thebes to secure his throne because his brother dies totally unexpectedly. So Mose goes, he claims his throne. This process of the coronation takes quite a while. There's a lot of ritual involved. He also tells us that his armies had gone out and that there had been, and we don't have a time frame reference because everything's told as though, you know, it all happened within maybe 2 or 3 days, but that's really not the case. Steels like this would have recorded history perhaps as long as a couple months, a year, maybe even a couple years rolled into a single event. They did not waste a precious stone and precious the work of hieroglyphics on a very detailed year-by-year chronicle. We do find that occasionally, but that is really in later history, and it post-dates even the Ramessid era to get detailed chronicles like that. So what we find is that Mose tells us that that the Hyksos and that the gods were responsible for this incredible destruction that was wrought on Egypt. He states that he and his men denuded themselves. They marched back to Thebes totally nude in order to perpetuate the gods. So this would have been seen as a sign of humility. You know, in the Hebrew text, we read that the sign of humility was putting on dust and ashes, you know, and showing yourself in this very humble and contrite state. Well, for Mose and his army, it was walking nude back to Egypt and demonstrating the humility that they were showing to the gods and trying to placate the gods, because Mose tells us of this incredible event that had occurred in Egypt. And he says, never has the like been done. And this phrase is a phrase that you find occasionally in Egyptian literature. And it expresses the utter despair, something that is beyond. I would say the Fukushima plant, the tsunami that accompanied it, that event, or say Akai, where you had the tsunami that hit there, and Thailand, where you had that utter devastation. Those are the type of events that this phrase is referred to, something that is so far out of the ordinary that no other words describe it. And so they would say, never has the like been done. So this is what Mose tells us. He tells us about a rainstorm, unprecedented rainstorm that had flooding. He says that that the huts, you know, the poor huts that people dwelt in, that they floated like reed canoes all throughout the land of Egypt. Archaeologically, we know that Memphis, right at this point in time, not previously and not later, shows that Memphis flooded in regions that were not even associated with the Nile. You had a lot of flooding. The palace flooded, and we're going to look at some of the exact statements that Mose makes in his stele. So I am on 466 if you guys want to follow along, and we are going to read the Mose stele, and we're starting with line 7. It says, the gods were vexed, they were angry, and part of the stele is damaged. Any time you see dots or you see a parenthesis, that indicates damaged text and a possible reconstruction based on the letters that's there. You know, sometimes if you have the word B-A, or maybe you have B blank B-Y, you know that it's probably an A is going to go in there because that's the only word that allows for that in the English language. Same thing in Egyptian hieroglyphics. There would often be only one hieroglyphic letter that you know would fit that spot. So it's very feasible reconstruction of that particular text. So it says, so of the gods, the sky came on with a rainstorm and darkness was in the western heavens. It rained without letting up, the cry of the people. Powerful thunder upon the mountains, louder than the noise of the cavern which is in Abydos. Then every house and hut, whereas they had repaired, collapsed, and the detritus was in the floodwater, like reed canoes at the very gate of the palace. And for a period of, and it doesn't say how many days, no lamp was ever lit in the two lands. Then His Majesty said, this is more serious than God's punishment, greater than the gods of judgment. So Egypt really doesn't have this idea of God's national punishment or God's national judgment. This is an expression that is totally out of character from anything that we know in Egyptian history. Now, if you will remember right, another piece of epigraphic evidence comes from another papyrus, and bear with me because the name of the papyrus escapes me at this moment. But in this papyrus, Apophis, who would have been king of the north, he would have lived in the Delta region. He had sent this inflammatory letter to Kamose, Amose's older brother, and basically trying to provoke a war between the north and the south. He claims that the hippopotamuses 200 miles south are keeping him awake at night. And he challenges, this is the arrogant Apophis of the north, challenges Kamose, who lives in Thebes, Amose's older brother. He challenges the gods to a duel. He says, let us see which one of us, between you and me, Kamose, which one's God is with him as protector. And we know from history that Apophis had the better hand. Initially, he won. We find the remains of Cinco Tayo, who would have been Kamose's father. He had an axe straight through his forehead, and Kamose dies. We don't know the circumstances. We know that Kamose and Apophis die like within a month of each other. We also know that Amose, the inheritor of the throne that we're talking about that wrote this stele, his oldest son dies right at this time. So here you have three deaths, totally out of context, all at the same time, and very unexplainable. And then we have this rainstorm. Remember, you have the ninth plague when God says, when he destroys the flax and he destroys their crops with hail and brimstone, he said, this is going to touch into the very heart of Egypt. And the reason YHWH said this is because the entire Egyptian economy rested on flax production. Flax was exported worldwide for its soft cotton-like feel that it produced, and a linen that was second to none. You know, all your kings, all of your monarchs, all your wealthy people throughout the world would trade with Egypt, and they would give them precious stones, gold. It didn't matter. They would trade for that precious cotton that then they could wear as clothing because it was so comfortable. So this is something where it was very, just very important to Egypt. Now, the fact that Amose states that this flood came from the western heavens, a lot of scholars say that this doesn't refer to a rainstorm, no weather event. This simply refers to the invasion of the Hyksos. Well, the problem with that theory is that the Hyksos would have come out of the east, and Amose says that this rainstorm came out of the west. Egyptian weather patterns, yes, they come from west and usually proceed to east, so it follows a weather event. The other thing that you find is that the flooding in Memphis you find that the lower levels before the flooding have Hyksos remains, and the upper levels above that flooding demonstrate an 18th dynasty, so a new era. So this flooding occurs sandwiched between Hyksos and 18th dynasty. The other thing that you find is that Ahmose tells of the gifts that he gave to refurbish the temples throughout Egypt. These are not normal pharaonic gifts to temples. In any other circumstances, it could be considered an insult, because what he gives them are very rudimentary furniture, nothing inlaid with gold, nothing really precious, just really basic wooden furniture that simply to make it serviceable. So it indicates that, you had massive loss of furniture, of housing materials. Many things would have been washed away and lost at this period, because he is giving all of this to lots of temples. And he talks about having to refurbish the temples which had been destroyed by the gods. And this is, again, gods don't destroy their own temples. So this is a very new idea in Egyptian thought and in Egyptian history. Ahmose's gifts to the temples could also indicate a tremendous loss of labor force, where they did not have a wide range of skilled laborers to craft the various materials that would then be deposited in the temple, in the various temples. You find that he talks about houses being torn by currents and this unspecified days of darkness. It's very fascinating, because we know it's more than one day. Where it would have said the number of days, the text is damaged. Now, in the Hebrew text, it says that there were 3 days of darkness, but it is very possible there were only 2 days. And the reason I say this is that in Hebrew, and this was a custom that was carried into the monarchy years, and then it divided, where the north reckoned numbers inclusively and the south did not reckon them inclusively. Or vice versa. I'm sorry, the South reckoned them inclusively and the North did not. And what that means is, today when we deal with numbers and we have a remainder, so we have, a whole with, say, a fraction left over. For us modernly, if we get to 5, then we will round up to the next whole number. In the north, in Ephraim, they would actually round down, so it would only be 2 days. In the south, in Judah, you would actually round up to 3 whole days. So it's very possible that these days of darkness may have just been 2.5 days in Egypt, and that really would have fit the context of what we know of the event that would have provoked and caused this horrific darkness throughout the land of Egypt. Now, something that is very interesting is that Ahmose states that it was impossible to light a lamp in Egypt. The corollary account in Exodus, and let's just read this real quick. Let me see here. Okay, so actually, I'm going to skip ahead to this part, and we're going to come back, since we're talking about the darkness event. In scripture, it says that the darkness could be felt, and then Ahmose states that it was impossible to light a lamp in Egypt. In a rainstorm, you can still light a lamp, even with I live in the South, where you really don't get any more humid than what we are here. Some days you're just really wearing it. And we can still light a lamp. You can pour just a little bit of fuel on it, which the Egyptians had tons of oil. They had tons of goose fat that they used for a lot of different purposes. It wouldn't take anything to light that goose fat on a reed or a torch and to have fire in the land. But it says it's impossible to light a lamp. The only situation that really makes sense in this context is if there was something in the air, something that actually prevented them from being able to light their torches. And we're going to come back to this in a minute, because there actually was something that prevented them from doing this. But notice also Ahmose talks about this thunder that accompanied this rainstorm, something that's uncharacteristic for Egypt. David states in Psalm 78, he says that there was frost and hail and marvelous things that YHWH did show on the fields of Zon. So this idea of frost, and we're talking about this event occurring in March. March in Egypt, I mean, you're typically getting into 80-degree weather. Your lows may be in the 60s, very unusually cold temperatures would be in the 50s. So to have a frost this late in the year, whether it's March or April, somewhere in that time period, is just really unheard of. So, but what you find is that if there is a world event that could cause frost way outside of normal seasonal changes, and we're going to look at that. Let's look at the corollary account. The reference, Moses' reference to the sound of the cavern at Abydos. This refers to a cavern where people would come and lament Osiris's death. It was a part of the Egyptian mystery religion. Women would especially go there and they would wail. And the way that this cavern was structured is that it echoed and it amplified the sound. So when these women just, whoa, made all this noise and wailed and lamented Osiris's death, it amplified, and it was a tremendous sound, and it could be a rumbling and whatever else. So he's saying that this thunder was way beyond anything that this cavern could produce. Now, the corollary account that we have is in Exodus 9:33 and 34, and I'm going to go ahead and read that. It says, "Behold, tomorrow about this time I will cause it to rain a very grievous hail, such as had not been in Egypt since the foundation of thereof until now. And Moses stretched forth his rod towards heaven, and Yahweh sent hail on the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mixed with the hail, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation." Now, this is a key phrase that you actually find in Pharaonic literature, this idea, it has never had the like been heard of in all the land of Egypt. So it really expresses utter devastation and just something that you really can't even wrap your mind around, the travesty of this particular event. So it says, "And Moses went out to the city from Pharaoh and spread abroad his hands to Yahweh, and thunders and hail ceased, and the rain was not poured upon the earth. Then Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail were gone, and he ceased, and he hardened his heart." But again, this is a rain event. So we have rain, we have hail, but this hail is mixed with fire. It could refer to lightning, but it's possible it refers to maybe something a little bit different. We have lamps that cannot be lit within the land of Egypt. We also find that there is thunder, and it is a darkness that can be felt. And again, very uncharacteristic to Egyptian literature, it attributes this to the judgment of the gods against, like, this idea of a national judgment. So what is it that has the ability to produce this? Now, before we get to what this actually was, there is evidence, especially at Tel El Makusta, right at this time period, that there was a massive earthquake that occurred shortly before the Exodus. And the answer to what could have caused all of this would have been the eruption of a super volcano. A super volcano can trigger well over a 9-point seismic event on any seismograph. It is something that is really can shake the entire earth. They have the ability to change weather patterns. In 1918, a particular, and let me get my book here real quick. A particular, and I forgot the name of this, let me get the name of this volcano. It was in the Solomon Islands. It erupted in 1918. It was a super volcano that caused horrific damage. The summer of 1918, they never had a summer. It is the year where we had the Irish potato famine, because it never warmed up. The highs for the summer only reached the 60s. New England, here in the United States, never had a summer. You had death really become throughout the land. You had the Spanish influenza that occurred, and you had the death of well over 5 million people, all because of a weather-related event. And I want to get the name of this. Let me see if I can find it real quick, because I did not put this in my notes. The name of this particular volcano. Hold on here. Bear with me here just a minute. Okay, and I'm going to show you guys a couple things that I find are just absolutely fascinating. And next time, I think Cindy's going to show me how to do the screen share, and I will scan these pictures so that way you guys can see them too on the screen. It will be much easier than trying to show you pictures out of a book. So anyways, right in the Mediterranean, not even 100 miles north of the Delta region, you have a supervolcano in the Mediterranean that, okay, so let's see, this was not it. Okay, this particular author discusses the eruption of Mount Pelée. Actually, this may be it, Mount Pelée. I'm going to have to look that back up because I did not have time to prep on this before our class tonight. But it might have been Mount Pelée. Oh, no, this is it. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1918. Krakatoa is what caused this incredible famine that was felt throughout the world for a good year, year and a half. And, you know, just learning this, I have started following volcanic eruptions. And I will say that every time you have an ash plume that goes up 2 miles into the atmosphere, we here in the South have uncharacteristically cold days for about 2 to 3 days. It can take a week later. Sometimes it's a month later because it depends on the jet stream. But we'll get 2 or 3 days where it's like 10 degrees below average, you know, where our normal weather may be in the 80s. All of a sudden we're around 71 and there's no cold front coming from Colorado. And how do you explain this colder weather event that you have for no reason at all? So with the eruption of Pharaoh, and this would have been Santorini, you find that it produces this ash cloud that goes 2 to 3 miles. It could even have gone 5 miles into the atmosphere. And when that happens, it does indeed disrupt weather patterns. And I'm going to show you, and let me see if you guys can see this. I'm going to get it really close here. This is showing, okay, I don't think it's focusing really well. Okay, this is showing the trajectory of a blast. And when it goes up into the atmosphere, it actually hits the stratosphere. And the ash will reflect UV rays so that you don't have heat. So when David says there is frost, well, if there's no sun coming through, yes, there could be a frost event. And what you find with this is that the gases emitted from the volcano can disrupt weather patterns throughout the region. We find that there is ash and pumice in the Negev, in certain sites that have been excavated. Below the ash, we find Hyksos remains. Above the ash, we find 18th dynasty. So the archaeology supports this. We also find that there is an unusual, and let me just back up before I go on. We also find ash in the Levant on the borders of what would have been Tyre, Sidon, all of those places. We find ash in some of those excavations as well. So this would have been a very unique event of a supervolcano erupting and really just shaking the world for about 2 years is about how long the effects would have taken to really dissipate and for the ash to fall out of the atmosphere. So you find that this event causes 3 days of darkness. It could even have had pumice that could have been on fire fall in the land of Egypt, because we have found pumice within the excavation. Manfred Bitek, who is excavating Alvarez, has said he expects to find a layer of ash at Alvarez, but he says that it's going to be hard to date it because of the moist region it absorbs. So it could go through several different layers just because it's so moist. The other thing that you find is all of a sudden, right at the end of the Hyksos period and at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, you find Minoan 1A frescoes. And these frescoes are not, some of them show signs for being tied to Cretan, being tied to Crete, but most of them are Minoan, and they really trace to that island of Santorini. It traces to the same style, the same texture that those Minoans would have made. You find those frescoes in Avarez. You find them at different sites along the Levant where a displaced Aegean population would have gone for shelter. Now, I will say this, I lived in Washington State when Mount St. Helens blew, and almost every volcano, whether we're talking about Pompeii, it really doesn't matter. Almost every volcano warns you that it's coming to life. It's not as though it is surprising. There are many, many earthquakes that increase in not only frequency, but also in magnitude before the actual event. So the wise people on the island probably would have left long before the actual event occurred, the actual explosion. We know that that particular eruption, that it created 70 feet worth of lava on the island, and it buried entire communities. Some of them have been excavated, but there's so many more to be excavated because they're all under a layer of lava, or layers of lava. Now, the dating of this eruption of Thera dates right around, let me look at this, right around 1565. The date that Israel's chronology for the Exodus reconstructs to is 1548. So we're talking a difference of 17 years. This really isn't that much of a difference. Amose, his mummy, where, he would have lived beyond the Exodus, probably a good 20 years past the Exodus, but his mummy, where he would have died, dates somewhere between 1570 and 1530. So you find all of these dating right within the time frame of Israel's Exodus and the plagues in Egypt. And what is fascinating is that God states that the reason for all the plagues, he states this in Exodus 9:16. He says, it's to show you my power and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. This was a catastrophic event that never had the like been seen before in all the land of Egypt, and never would it be seen for again. It was something that was very unique to Egyptian history, and this is why we find, as we'll see in just a moment, and we are going to go over tonight, since we did get a late start, we'll probably go over by about 15 minutes. But this is why you find in later epochs, they still refer to this horrible event. It's like us 20, 30 years down the line, still referring to 9/11, or forbid should there be some event worse than 9/11, and we discuss it. To this day, 60, 70 years later, we're still talking about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It is that type of event that all the pharaohs refer to, some of them, 70, 80, 100 years later, because it was just that horrific. So let's recap just real quick all the similarities. Mose came to the throne after his brother's untimely death. A violent storm that came out of the west fell upon the land of Egypt. There was thunder that is characteristic of the seventh plague. It says that there was darkness that lasted for a couple of days. There was flooding. There's also the fact that this darkness endured for a period of time, and that it was so thick you couldn't light a torch because of, if there's ash suspended in the air, you can't even go outside, because if you go outside you literally suffocate when you breathe that air in. Places like Yakima, Washington, people could not even go outside when Mount St. Helens blew. You had to wear masks and coverings, and it was still very difficult because when you take a breath, you were breathing in ash and it got into your lungs, and then you'd get asthmatic, and it was irritating and it hurt. So you're not going to exactly go and get more oil if you've exhausted what your resources within your home. And then you find that Mose, uncharacteristic to Egyptian thought, he juxtaposes the judgment of a great God against the other gods of Egypt, as though this was the act of a great God. And that, again, is something that you find really nowhere else in Egyptian history. A little bit under Akhenaten, but it's a different context. You also find that, and I didn't mention this before, but you find that there's incredible destruction of mortuary temples. He states that he has to go throughout all the land of Egypt, and he has to recommission and put back the images of all the gods in all of these temples throughout the land of Egypt. I mean, the gods had been smashed, they had been destroyed. So he has to recommission, he has to recreate and refurbish all of these temples. We find that there's evidence of plundering of the temples at this time. And you find that this idea that never had the light been seen before in all the land of Egypt. You find that in the biblical text as well as in Egypt. Now, you find if you go forward 70 years after Mose, you have the woman Pharaoh, Hatshepsut, who comes to the Egyptian throne, and she talks about this horrific event caused by the Hyksos. And this is what she says. She says, the roads were formerly blocked, were on all sides, are now trodden. My troops, which formerly had nothing, are now equipped with the best things since my accession as king. Great Paquette, who courses through the valley, and this is the name of a god, she was like a leopard goddess, in the eastern desert, who opens the rain-swept road. I have restored that which was destroyed. I raised up that which was formerly shattered. Since the Asiatics were in the midst of the delta at Avarez, when the nomads in their midst were destroying what had been made, they ruled without law, and they did not act by divine decree. Right down to my majesty's time. So Hatshepsut is talking about this time prior to her reign, where the Hyksos had destroyed the Delta region, where they had just caused this incredible destruction that she is remembering. She says that she cleared out rain-swept roads. And this is a long time after the event had happened. So it indicates a huge labor loss, that this would not have been recovered within 10, maybe 15 years of the Exodus. It also indicates that the destruction was so massive across such a large scale of Egypt that it took many, many years for this recovery process and for this flooding event. Several hundred years later, now we're going to fast forward about 350 years later, Ramses II, who is traditionally credited with being the Pharaoh of the Exodus, his father set up a stele in the land, or in the Delta region, commemorating the god Seth, who was identified as the Asiatics god, and he's often equated with Baal. But this is a sign that they felt like the Asiatics during the reign of Ramesses were again becoming a force that needed to be recognized. Ramses had deported a lot of Asiatics from Canaan, a lot of Hebrews. You read through Ramesses' records, you find that he captured Epirus and he deported them back to Egypt and put them in servitude. So he establishes this still commemorating the 400th year anniversary for the Asiatics being in the Delta region and the founding of the cult of Seth. So this again is the fact that, you know, they still have this memory within Egyptian history. Now I'm going to go ahead and wait. Tomorrow night we're going to finish. I only got up to page 473. So next week we'll combine both the plagues with this idea of a civil war that occurred right around the time of Moses's birth, and really occasioned a lot of the background that we read in the Exodus story that really informs, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. And I think when we look to that, we get a better idea of what was going on for Egypt and for Israel. So next time we will do that and go through the all the plagues. If I need to adjust it a little bit, I will, because that's really it's about 40 pages to cover, and I don't think we'll do that in one class, so I may break it up and go ahead and extend the class out just a little bit further. But at this time, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for discussions and any comments or questions. You know, I really find this, for people who are so skeptical of the text, I think you really have to jump through hoops to discount all the convergence of the Exodus story with the evidence that we have from archaeology, as well as from the written text, whether it's the Amose stele or whether it is the evidence of ash and pumice. It really all fits the context of the biblical record. And as we get into the conquest, to me, the archaeology of Canaan is even far more convincing than even what we have in Egypt. So again, any comments or questions, please just jump right in and feel free to ask. Now, I do want to invite everyone to join us June 10th and 11th in St. Francisville, Louisiana. We will be having an event there at the synagogue, and it would be a great opportunity to meet many of you guys and to just hang out and fellowship together. So, okay, I'm not seeing any questions or comments, so I am going to go ahead and close the class down. Thank you for sticking with us. I know it was a little iffy tonight, trying to get to a new room and getting the audio working, but have a great evening. Hope to see you all tomorrow.